Hello everyone and welcome to today's Sons of the Forest modding tutorial. Today we are going to be showing you how to make your own config settings for mods that use Redloader. To download the template for this tutorial, go to Git, Clone Repository, GitHub, go here, copy this, paste it here, click on the configs tutorial, and hit clone. I already have mine, so I don't need to do this. First, make sure that you have Harmony Patch all uncommented. It should come uncommented by default with the mod. Same with this. You always want to add this to the mod. It makes things a lot easier, so you can use message like this instead of rlog message. The first thing you need to know is that you need settings registry create settings in on skd initialized for any mod that uses config settings. What I mean by config settings are this right here. We'll come back to this soon. Let's for now click on the config cs file. In config cs, this is where you set up the config data for your mod. This way you can have different mod settings that players can change from the config settings. Config categories are containers for config entry data. Without a config category, config entry data won't show up. Settings UI headers are red text that you could show between your config entries. This is where you put the text that you want your UI header to show. This is where you put the alignment. And this, if you turn this to false, then your text will be in bold. I'm going to leave it at true for now. Settings UI headers require TM Pro and Suns SKD attributes. Suns SKD attributes, you can just type it in, and it comes with Suns SKD. But for TM Pro, you want to go into Dependencies, Browse, make sure you're in Sons of the Forest Redloader Game, type in Text Mesh Pro, install that. I already have mine installed, so I don't need to do that. Now I'm going to go over the kinds of config entries that you can create. First off, let me mention that you can name these whatever you want, but I recommend naming them something easy to remember and easy to type. Float values and integer values are numerical values that are associated with real numbers. Float values and integer values are always set to 0 by default. The key difference between float values and integer values is that float values allow for decimals, while integer values are whole numbers. Float and integer values are commonly used for things like adjusting stat values or adjusting the brightness of the light, things like that. Like you see here. Bool config entries are basically toggles, like you can see here. They can only ever be true or false, and you can use this to turn certain things on or off. Bool config entries are commonly used for turning certain systems in the mod on or off. String config entries are containers of text that the player can adjust in the menu. Like, for example, my string value, I have a value called string right here. I can name it whatever I want. And revert it. String config entries are commonly used for things like changing the names of items, the player character, or anything that requires changing a text or customizing a certain text within the game by the player. Keybind config entries let the player set a keybind, and then when they press that key, something happens. As you can see here, and you can also revert it. Color config entries create a color wheel in the menu that you can use to change the color of certain things. Color wheels are commonly used to change the colors of textures, materials, stuff like that in game. Pretty self-explanatory, really. And finally, we have another config entry right here. Now this one is a little bit different than the one before because this one allows you to create an options panel that allows you to sift through a number of different options and select certain things for the player to use. This is how the options panel looks in the config settings. Before we move on to the next part, I want to quickly mention that the settings UI header and the config entries are all ordered in the position that you see them right here. So whatever position you have them listed in right here will be the position that they appear in the config settings. This part is where you actually initialize all the entries so that they are created on the menu and visible to everyone. Now, by the way, you don't have to type out all this information each time in each of your projects manually. Just copy and paste this from here into your own projects and adjust the variable names accordingly. The first thing to note is that your config entry variables always need to be under a category like this. However, their order under the category doesn't matter. That's determined by up here. And when you want a new category with new config entry variables, what you do is new category variable name, like that. Let's take a look at my float config entry right here and go over what all of these fields next to create entry do. This field is just an identifier. You need to make sure that these fields are unique to each entry though. This is the default float value. This is the name that appears next to the config entry in the config settings. This is the text that appears on the tooltip when you hover over it. This is the min and max values of the slider. Everything I said above also applies here. However, just keep in mind that integer values can't use decimals. Bool config entries are very similar. The only thing is that this is either true or false. If you want the toggle for my bool to be off, you want to have it as false. If you want it to be on by default, then you set this to true. For keybind config entries, this is where you set the key that's being used by default for the configs. And this here is where you put the method that you want to have execute your logic for when the key is pressed. Let's go back to the configs tutorial CS. And you can see my method right here. This contains the logic I want to use. And what this is doing is that if my bool is false, then it executes all of these messages. This will happen anytime a player presses K. And if I change this to true, then the player needs to have the myBool toggle on in order for the code within this if statement to execute. Now, just to be clear, this if statement is not actually needed. You could just have all these messages played directly in the method itself without this if statement. This is just to give you an example of how the toggles work and how you can execute code for config settings based on what the player toggles on and off. Now let's take a look at this code right here. What this does is that this fires every time the player changes the toggle myBool, and then it plays a message right here like this. You can use this if you want to trigger certain logic to happen when the player changes a setting. For example, that's one thing you can do. But let's expand upon this and add more conditions. Let's do an if statement. Copy and paste that. And we can also do an else statement here so that if config myBool value is not equal to true, then let's say we could do this. Now what will happen is that if config myBool value is not equal to true, which it automatically checks for when you put an else statement like this, then the player's health will be negative 20, or it will be the target health negative 20. Whereas if it's true, then it'll be plus 20. You can also use other config values for this too. Let's change this to my float. Now if the config value is greater than or equal to 10, then the target health will go up plus 20, and this will trigger. If it is not, then local player vitals target health will go a bit down by negative 20. I still have two more config values to cover, so let's go back to config CS. For my color, the only thing that is different from the previous ones is that you need to set this. This is the default value for the color, and currently the color is set to white with these float values put in place. Real quick, I just organized this one to be a little more in line with the other ones. Just my personal preference. For this, the main thing you need to know is that this is the default value, and the other fields here are similar to the other previous ones. And what's different about this one is that you need to pull from a dictionary for this one. This is where the dictionary is, and this is where you put the names for your different selections. And then you put them right here. Just copy and paste this into your own project and adjust the variable names accordingly. I'm going to cover how to execute code using my options in another video, as it's a little bit more complicated than the other things. For this part, basically any code that you put in here will get executed when the settings UI closes. Okay, I think that just about covers everything that I intended to cover within the scope of this video. If you have any further questions, feel free to ask in the modding section of the Sons of the Forest Discord. There are a lot of mod devs there that are available to help answer questions, and it's a great place to get your questions answered.